The cardboard box weighed less than I expected. 23 years at Helix Aerospace, and everything that belonged to me fit inside one banker's box from the supply closet on the fourth floor. A framed photo of my daughter Lily when she was 7, holding a model rocket we'd built from a kit, a coffee mug she made me in pottery class, 3 engineering notebooks with leather covers worn soft from a decade of pocket carry, a small brass slide rule my father gave me the day I graduated from MIT in 1998. That was the visible inventory of a career. The invisible inventory was what they didn't know they were losing. 4 months later, the same woman who fired me would drive across Seattle in the rain, sit at my kitchen table, hold a coffee mug my daughter made in 3rd grade, and ask me to save the $4 billion program. Her company could no longer run without me. She would come alone. Without what? Without a lawyer. Because she could not afford for anyone else to hear what she was about to say out loud. What she didn't know on that Tuesday morning, what nobody at Helix Aerospace knew, was that the propulsion system her company had been building for 9 years rested on a piece of mathematics that existed in only 3 places on Earth. A sealed archive at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that required secret-level clearance to open, a leather notebook in the bottom drawer of my desk at home, and inside my head. The first 2 places she couldn't reach. The 3rd place, she had just fired and walked to the elevator. And 4 months after that, my 14-year-old daughter would stand in our kitchen doorway with her backpack still on her shoulders, look at the most powerful aerospace executive in the Pacific Northwest sitting at our broken-handled kitchen table, and finally understand something about her father that I had never been able to tell her myself. But that was all later. On that gray Tuesday in October, I didn't know any of it yet. I only knew 3 things. I knew Vanessa Cole had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. I knew I was going to let her make it. And I knew when she came to me, and she would come, I wasn't going to ask for my job back. I was going to ask for something she didn't yet understand was worth far more. I was 48 years old, divorced, raising a 14-year-old daughter on my own. And as of 9:47 a.m., I was unemployed. The security escort was a kid named Marcus, who I'd taught to fly fish on a company retreat in 2019. He looked at the floor the whole walk to the elevator. "I'm really sorry, Mr. Chen," he said when the doors opened. I told him it wasn't his fault, and I meant it. The rain was coming down in that fine, patient Seattle way when I stepped onto Boren Avenue with my box. I didn't have a coat. I hadn't thought I'd need one when I came to work that morning. I sat in my truck in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I could turn the key. They thought they'd inherited a system. They'd inherited a language only one person on Earth still spoke fluently. And they just fired him. The drive home took 40 minutes in the rain. I lived in a 2-bedroom rental in Ballard, North End, near the locks. My ex-wife had taken the house in Bellevue 4 years ago, along with most of our savings and her dignity, both of which she'd needed badly. I didn't blame her. The marriage had ended for 1,000 small reasons, none of them dramatic. Lily lived with me full-time because her mother had moved to Phoenix with a new husband who didn't want a teenager around. That was the kind of thing my daughter pretended didn't hurt her. I unlocked the door, set the box on the kitchen counter, and stood there for a long time looking at the photo of 7-year-old Lily and the rocket. She was missing her 2 front teeth in that picture. She had grease on her chin from the model glue. She'd insisted on doing the engine mount herself. The current? Lily came home from school at 3:42. I heard her drop her backpack in the hallway, kick off her sneakers, and call out, "Dad, did you eat lunch? You always forget lunch." I told her I'd eaten. I hadn't. She came into the kitchen, 14 years old, tall like her grandmother, wearing the gray hoodie I'd bought her for her birthday. She saw the box. She saw the photo on top. She saw my face. She didn't ask anything for a long moment. Then she said, "They fired you." I nodded. She walked over, opened the refrigerator, took out 2 apples, handed one to me, and sat down at the small kitchen table without saying anything else. We ate apples together in silence for maybe 5 minutes. That's the thing about Lily. She has my temperament. She doesn't fill space with words. Finally, she said, "Are we going to be okay?" I told her yes. I told her we had savings to think, and then I was going to figure out the next move. She studied my face the way her mother used to, looking for the lie underneath the steady voice. She didn't find one, because I wasn't lying. She said, "Dad, the lady who fired you, was she the one in the magazine?" I nodded. She said, "Was she smart enough to know what she just did?" I told her no. I told her she would be eventually. I told her it would take her about 4 months to understand. Lily looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Okay." That was the moment, I think, that she stopped being a child in the way she'd been a child the day before. She didn't cry. She didn't ask more questions. She just absorbed it. She has my temperament that way too. That night, after she went to bed, I sat in the kitchen with a yellow legal pad and made a list of what I still had. Not what I'd lost. What I still had. 23 years of aerospace propulsion experience, 12 issued patents, 6 of which Helix didn't own. A working knowledge of a proprietary mathematical framework I'd developed at JPL in 2003 for a NASA upper stage program that had won the company a Collier Trophy. A network of about 40 senior engineers across the industry who would take my call at midnight if I asked. A daughter who needed to see her father stand up straight, and about $86,000 in a savings account that would last us roughly 14 months if I was careful. The list was longer than I'd expected. I went to bed at 2 a.m. and slept better than I had in 3 years. The first week, I didn't look for a job. I fixed the leaking gutter over Lily's bedroom window that I'd been meaning to fix since August. I changed the oil in the truck. I drove Lily to school instead of letting her take the bus. She gave me side-eye on Thursday and said, "Dad, you're being weird. You're being present. Stop it. It's making me suspicious." I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in 2 months. The second week, I called an old friend named Hank Brennan. Hank had retired from Boeing in 2017 and now ran a small consulting firm out of a converted boathouse on Lake Union. He answered on the second ring. "David Chen," he said. "I heard. I'm sorry. Also, I'm not sorry because you're free now. What do you need?" I told him I needed to think. He said, "Come by Friday. Bring your daughter." We went on Friday. Hank had a 1962 wooden cabin cruiser he was restoring. Lily climbed all over it asking questions about the bilge pump and the diesel conversion. Hank watched her with the soft eyes of a man who'd lost his own daughter to leukemia in 2009. After Lily wandered off to look at the engine bay, Hank turned to me and said quietly, "You know what they're going to find out about Athena, right?" I said I had an idea. He said, "How long do you give them?" I said 90 days, maybe 120 if their lead architect is smarter than I think. Hank smiled into his coffee. He isn't. I worked with him at Lockheed. Decent engineer. Not what you are. He paused. What are you going to do when they call you? I told him I didn't know yet. That was almost true. What I knew about Athena that Vanessa Cole did not. The propulsion system Helix had been building for the Department of Defense was a hybrid solid-liquid architecture for next-generation hypersonic vehicles. $4.1 billion over 7 years. First flight test scheduled for March. The design relied on a thermal regulation framework I'd written in 2003 when I was 28 years old at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, solving a specific cascading failure issue in compound curve combustion chambers under variable atmospheric pressure. I'd written it in a custom mathematical notation because the standard tools didn't model the problem correctly. When Helix acquired the firm that had originally licensed my framework, they inherited the code. They never inherited the documentation. For 9 years, the framework sat inside the Athena code base like a foundation stone. Nobody touched it because everything above it depended on it, and nobody understood the math well enough to refactor it safely. Vanessa Cole had been brought in 2 years ago to modernize Helix's engineering practices. She'd looked at Athena and seen what she called technical debt. She'd hired a younger team to rewrite the propulsion architecture from the ground up. Cutting me was the symbolic last step of that transition. The problem was that the modern frameworks didn't actually solve the cascading failure issue. They modeled it. They predicted it. They couldn't prevent it. My 2003 math wasn't outdated. It was load-bearing. She didn't know that. Her team didn't know that. They were about to find out. In November, I started a small consulting practice from my kitchen table. I called it Chen Propulsion Consulting, registered it as an LLC with the state of Washington for $40, and built a single-page website on a Sunday afternoon while Lily did her algebra homework across from me. I didn't market it. Within 2 weeks, I had 3 contracts from people who'd heard through the grapevine that I was independent. What I didn't tell anyone, not even Hank, was that I was tracking Helix from the outside. Public filings, industry chatter. A friend at the Pentagon who would tell me, in careful language, that things were not on schedule. Every week, the news got a little worse for them. Every week, the silence from my old phone number got a little longer. I wasn't waiting. I was preparing. There's a difference. Waiting is passive. Preparing is the work you do while the other side learns the cost of underestimating you. A small launch startup in Kent paid me $12,000 to fix their second-stage thermal model. A university lab at Washington State paid me $4,000 to review a graduate student's combustion simulation. A defense subcontractor in Everett had a problem with regenerative cooling that their team had been stuck on for 6 months. I solved it in 4 days and charged them $18,000. None of these contracts were large. All of them were doors. Each one opened to a room with 3 more doors inside. Lily watched me work. She'd come home from school, drop her backpack, and sit at the table across from me with her own homework. We'd work in parallel for 2 or 3 hours, occasionally asking each other questions. She got curious about what I did in a way she hadn't been curious before when I worked at Helix. At Helix, I was just dad who leaves for work. Now I was dad who solves things at the kitchen table. She started asking me to explain the problems. I started explaining them at a high school level, drawing diagrams on the back of her homework sheets. She was good at it. She had her grandfather's mind. One night in early December, she looked up from a sketch I'd made of a combustion chamber and said, "Dad, this is really hard math, isn't it?" I said it was, yes. She said, "Then why did they fire you?" I told her sometimes people in charge don't always understand what their best people are doing. Sometimes they think a calm person is a slow person. Sometimes they think a quiet person doesn't have anything to say. She thought about that for a long time. Then she said, "That's stupid." I told her it was. She said, "Are they going to figure out they made a mistake?" I said I thought they probably would. She said, "What are you going to do when they do?" I told her I hadn't decided yet. That was the second time I'd lied to her that month. Both times about the same thing. I had decided. I'd decided the night they walked me to the elevator. I just hadn't told anyone, including myself, out loud yet. The first call from Helix came on January 11th. It was Daniel Wu, the lead engineer on the new propulsion team. Decent man. We'd worked together for 6 years before Vanessa Cole had restructured around him. He sounded tired. He said, "David, I know how this sounds. We're having some trouble with the Phase 4 thermal validation. I was wondering if I could buy you a coffee and ask you a couple of questions." I told him Thursday. We met at a cafe in Fremont. He ordered black coffee. He didn't touch it. He pulled out a laptop and showed me a simulation output. The cascading failure problem was emerging exactly where I'd known it would emerge, in the third compound curve transition under high-altitude pressure variance. His team had been chasing it for 6 weeks. They thought it was a meshing artifact. I looked at the simulation for about 90 seconds. Then I closed the laptop and slid it back across the table. I said, "Daniel, I can help you, but not as a favor, and not informally. If Helix wants my help, Helix calls me through the proper channels." He nodded slowly. He said, "She's not going to call you." I said, "Then you have a problem." He looked at his coffee. He said, "Off the record, what is it?" I told him, off the record, that the issue wasn't in the new code. The new code was solving the wrong problem. The cascading failure wasn't a meshing artifact, and it wasn't a thermal gradient miscalculation. It was a mathematical singularity that emerged from the geometry itself, and the only way to resolve it was with a specific change of variables that wasn't documented in any modern textbook because it had been developed for a classified program in 2003 and never published. He stared at me. I said, "Tell her what I told you, or don't. That's between you and her, but the flight test is in March, and you don't have time." I paid for the coffee on the way out. The second call came on January 19th. 8 days. Less than I'd estimated. It was Vanessa Cole's executive assistant. She asked if I would be available to meet with Miss Cole at the Helix corporate offices on Friday afternoon. I told her no. I told her my schedule was full, but if Ms. Cole wanted to drive to my office, I had 30 minutes available on Wednesday at 2 p.m. My office was my kitchen table. There was a long pause. The assistant said she would check and call back. She called back 40 minutes later. Ms. Cole would see me at my office on Wednesday at 2 p.m. I hung up the phone and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the rain on the cedar fence in the backyard. Lily was at school. The house was quiet. I let myself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. Then I made a list of what I would say and what I would not say, and I put the list inside the leather notebook in the bottom drawer of my desk where the 2003 math lived, and I went outside to rake the wet leaves off the front walk because Vanessa Cole was going to step on that walk in 3 days and I wanted it to be clean. I told Lily about it that night over dinner. Spaghetti. I told her the CEO who had fired me 4 months ago was coming to our kitchen on Wednesday. She put down her fork. She said, "Here? She's coming here?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Dad, our kitchen has the broken cabinet handle." I said I knew. She said, "Are you going to make her sit at our kitchen table?" I said I was. She thought about that for a long time. Then she said, "Can I be home when she comes?" I said school got out at 2:45 and the meeting started at 2. She said, "Can I skip 8th period?" I told her no, she could not skip 8th period. She said, "Can I come home fast?" I told her she could come home as fast as the bus would bring her. She nodded. She picked up her fork. She said, "Don't yell at her, Dad. Just be you. She'll figure it out." I told her I had no intention of yelling. She said, "I know. That's why she'll figure it out." Vanessa Cole arrived at 2:03 p.m. on Wednesday. She came alone, which surprised me. I'd expected a lawyer or a deputy. She was wearing a navy blazer and carrying a leather portfolio. She stood on my porch in the cold rain for a moment before I opened the door. I could see her looking at the rented duplex, at the wet pile of cedar mulch by the steps, at the unfixed second porch light. I let her in. I offered her coffee. She accepted. I poured it into Lily's pottery mug, the one with the lopsided handle, because all my other mugs were in the dishwasher and I didn't want to lie about it. I gave her the mug. She held it carefully, like it might break. We sat at the kitchen table. She said, "David, I appreciate you taking this meeting." I waited. She said, "We have a situation with the Phase 4 validation. I'm sure Daniel briefed you. Our analysis suggests that the original thermal regulation framework contains a number of, let's say, undocumented design choices that the new team has been unable to fully reverse engineer in the available timeline. We'd like to discuss bringing you back on a consulting basis." I waited some more. She said, "We're prepared to offer a generous rate, $250 an hour, up to 200 hours. $50,000. She was offering me $50,000 to save a $4 billion program. I said, "Vanessa, I'm going to tell you a few things, and I want you to listen carefully because we only need to have this conversation once." She set the mug down. I said, "The framework you're trying to reverse engineer wasn't developed at Helix. It wasn't developed at the firm Helix acquired. It was developed by me in 2003 at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory under a classified NASA program. The mathematical notation is mine. The change of variables approach is mine. I hold the original notebooks. JPL holds the sealed archive. Helix holds the implementation, which it licensed in good faith in 2014 from a firm that itself had a license, not ownership, of the underlying mathematics." She was very still. I said, "Your new team can't reverse engineer it because the notation isn't documented anywhere they have access to. The math itself is sound, but the specific variable substitution that resolves the cascading failure singularity is something I developed by hand over 4 months in 2003 and never published. It exists in 2 places, in my head and in a notebook in the desk drawer 6 feet from where you're sitting." She didn't speak. I said, "Your flight test is in March. You have, by my estimate, 7 weeks of useful engineering time before you have to either fly or delay. A delay at this stage triggers a contract review at the Pentagon and likely a recompete. You won't survive a recompete. You don't have the bench. She still didn't speak. I said, I will help you, but not as an hourly consultant. I will license the framework to Helix Aerospace for a flat fee of $4 million, plus a royalty of 0.5% of the Athena program revenue for the life of the contract. I will personally lead the integration. I will train Daniel Wu and 2 other engineers of my choosing to maintain the system going forward. And there is one other condition. She finally spoke. She said, which is? I said, when you walk back into your building tomorrow, you tell your senior leadership team exactly why you came to my kitchen today. Not a sanitized version, the real one. You tell them that you fired the man who designed the foundation of your flagship program because you mistook his quietness for obsolescence. You tell them you sat at his kitchen table and asked him for help. You tell them because the next time one of your senior engineers is quiet in a meeting, I want someone in that room to remember what quiet can mean. She looked at the mug. She looked at the framed photo of Lily and the rocket on the windowsill. She looked at me. She said, why does that matter to you? I said, because my daughter is going to come home from school in 40 minutes, and I want her to know what her father is worth. Not from me, from the people who tried to throw him away. She agreed. I knew she would. She didn't have a choice, and she was, underneath the corporate armor, a smart enough person to know it. We signed a term sheet on the kitchen table. She used a pen she pulled from her portfolio. I used the pen Lily kept in the mug by the toaster, the one with the chewed cap. Lily came home at 3:08 p.m. Vanessa was still at the table gathering her things. Lily stopped in the doorway with her backpack still on. She looked at the woman in the navy blazer. She looked at me. She didn't say anything. Vanessa stood up. She walked over to my daughter and held out her hand. She said, you must be Lily. I'm Vanessa Cole. I work with your father. I came here today to ask him to help me with a problem at my company. He's agreed to help us, on his terms, which are entirely fair. Lily shook her hand. She has a good handshake. I taught her. Vanessa said, your father is the best engineer I've ever worked with. I made a mistake 4 months ago that I'm going to spend a long time correcting. I wanted you to hear me say that out loud. Lily looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, okay? That was all she said. Okay. But I watched her face, and I saw something settle into it that I hadn't seen before. Not pride exactly. Something quieter than pride. Recognition. The recognition that the world had finally seen what she'd always suspected. Vanessa left. The door closed behind her. The rain was still coming down. Lily dropped her backpack on the floor and walked over to me. She didn't hug me. She just stood next to my chair and put her hand on my shoulder for a moment. She said, Dad? I said, yes, sweetheart. She said, that was really cool. I laughed. After everything, that was what she said. That was really cool, and I said, thanks, kid. She said, can we get pizza tonight? Like the good kind. From Serious Pie, not the freezer kind. I told her yes, we could get the good kind. The contract closed on February 8th. The integration work took 6 weeks of 14-hour days. I worked from a small office I rented in Fremont, 10 minutes from the house, so I could be home for dinner with Lily every night. Daniel Wu and 2 engineers I selected, a woman named Priya Subramanian and a young man named Ben Olafson, worked alongside me. By the time we were finished, all 3 of them could read my notation fluently. The framework would outlive me at Helix now. That was the point. That had always been the point. The Athena flight test happened on March 27th at White Sands. It was successful. The propulsion system performed within nominal parameters across all 4 test envelopes. The cascading failure singularity didn't appear because the math had been written 22 years earlier to prevent it. Vanessa Cole sent me a handwritten note the day after the test. It said, "Thank you. I will not forget what you said about quiet." V. I kept the note in the drawer with the original notebooks. The $4 million cleared into my account on April 14th. I paid off the rest of the mortgage on the house in Bellevue, which my ex-wife was still carrying because Lily would inherit it someday. And I didn't want my daughter to grow up watching her mother struggle. I put $2 million into a trust for Lily's education. I bought myself nothing. Well, I bought one thing. I bought a 1965 wooden runabout from a man in Anacortes, 16 feet long, mahogany hull, original Chris Craft engine that needed a complete rebuild. Lily and I drove up on a Saturday morning to look at it. She climbed all over it, asking questions about the bilge and the steering linkage and the engine timing. The man selling it watched her and then looked at me and said, "She's going to be an engineer, isn't she?" I said I didn't know. I said it was up to her. Lily looked up from the engine bay with grease on her chin, the way she'd had grease on her chin when she was 7, and she said, "Dad, can we fix it together?" I told her yes, we could fix it together. We put the boat on a trailer and drove it home through the rain. Lily fell asleep in the passenger seat somewhere south of Mount Vernon, her head against the window, her hand resting on the dashboard, the way her mother used to rest her hand when we were first dating, palm up, fingers slightly curled, asking nothing. The rain followed us all the way home. People sometimes ask me, when they hear this story, what I learned from it. They want a lesson. They want a moral. I don't have one for them. What I have is this. My daughter is 17 now. She's applying to engineering programs. Her top choice is MIT, where I went, but she's also looking at Stanford and Caltech and the University of Washington because she wants to stay close to home. She hasn't decided. She doesn't need to decide yet. The boat is finished. We launched it on Lake Union last summer. The engine runs clean. Vanessa Cole resigned from Helix 18 months after the Athena flight test. She started a foundation that funds engineering scholarships for first-generation college students. The first scholarship she awarded went to a young woman from South Seattle, whose father was a janitor at Boeing. I sit on the foundation's advisory board. I do not get paid for the work. I do it because it matters. Daniel Wu is now the Chief Technology Officer at Helix. He calls me every other Tuesday to talk through whatever problem his team is wrestling with. He learned patience, he told me once, from watching me. I am 52 years old. I live in the same rented duplex in Ballard because I never moved, because Lily liked the school and the neighborhood, and the way the light came through the kitchen window in the afternoon. I drive the same truck. I drink coffee from the same lopsided mug my daughter made me when she was 9. I am, by most measures the world uses, a quiet man. The world, in its own quiet way, eventually figured out what that meant.